One of the core properties that you have in CSS is the position property. This really lets you control how things are laid out on the page. So in the original CSS spec, there were three properties: static, absolute, and relative. Or sorry, three values for the position property. Static is the default. That's everything on the page. If you don't talk about position, it is position static. And that means it flows from top to bottom and then either left to right or right to left, depending on which direction the text flow is on the page. In CSS 2.1, the fixed property was added that allowed you to keep something positioned at a place on the page that would stay there as the page was scrolled. And then sticky was added as part of CSS 3. Sticky allows you to do something like fixed, but it's contained within a certain area. So it will stay on the screen until the area has gone. So I'm going to talk about the first four of these. I have a video already on sticky, so I'll put a link to that at the end of this video. But the other four properties are the ones I'm going to talk about here. So static, I have all four of these divs with the class box with the same properties. So border, padding, and margin. Border, obviously, padding around the text, margin outside to keep them apart from each other. And by default, they're all set to position static. Now, if we are to take the second one, let's talk about relative. So if I add position relative to the second and third, you can see visually there's no difference between them. And that's because position relative doesn't want to move anything from where it originally was. By default, it's going to stay exactly where it would be with static. And that is until you start adding properties like top, left, right, bottom to move it from where it originally was. So if I was to say top is 5, or let's say 50 pixels, you can see box 2 has been moved down 50 pixels from where it originally was, but nothing else on the page has gone anywhere. The original space where this was is still there. It's just that we've taken it and shifted it from its original position. So the space is where it originally was. The actual object has been moved away from there. So we can, let's say, set the left to 200 pixels, push it over, and we can see that the original size is maintained. The box is actually pushed over off the screen here. We got the scroll bar indicating that. So the original width is maintained. It's pushed over and pushed down, but the original space is still there, the same. We can do the same thing, shifting it to the right. We could change top to bottom. And then this is relative to the bottom, the original bottom position of where it was. It's shifted up 50 pixels from there. So that's relative. Moving it relative to where it originally was without affecting the space. So without affecting anything else on the page. It keeps its original space that it required and just moves away from that point. That's what relative does. With absolute, now you can see that there is a change. When we make something into absolute, the content immediately becomes wrapped. So the box shrinks down to contain only its content. It has no idea how big the page is, how big anything else on the page is, so it just shrinks down to wrap its content. Absolute does that by default. As soon as you say absolute, you lose any reference to anything else. You'll notice also box 4 slid up underneath it, and that's because when you do something with absolute, this element is removed from the page, the rest of the layout is made, and then this is put back onto the page. Now, don't confuse that with the Z index. The order that things are laid out on the page still has to do with the order that they're written in the HTML. We can add a Z-index property to change the stacking order, but by default, if you haven't specified Z-index, it will be in the order that they're written from top to bottom in the HTML. But position absolute means it was taken away, the rest of the page was built, determining sizes for everything else, and then it's put back. And it's put back where it originally was. Now the reason that it's shifted down a little bit Like box 4 moved up and took the exact spot that box 3 did have previously. Box 3 is shifted down slightly, and that is because with my position absolute, it takes its original position. This is where it was, just like relative did. And then the margin is applied from that point to push it down. We can, at this point, add top, left, bottom, right, the same as we did with relative. But the measurements for this, if we do top 50 pixels, it's measuring it from the top of the screen. So there's 1 rem of margin and then 50 pixels to push this down. You want to push it over. We can do that as well. So left, 200 pixels. And then it's pushed 200 pixels over from the edge of the screen, plus there's the little bit of margin there. So we have down 50 over 200 pixels. We can say we want to change this to right. It's now away from the right edge of the page. If we change top to bottom, it's now away from the bottom of the page, plus that the 1 rem of margin. So that's moved away from the page. We can, with absolute, however, do some other interesting things, like this. I want the top to be 50 pixels and the bottom to be 50 pixels away. I want the right side to be 200 pixels. I want the left side to be 200 pixels. We can't do this with relative because we're moving things relative to where it was originally positioned. We haven't affected the size in any way. With absolute, you lose that size. So now we're talking about distances from different parts of the screen. Okay, so relative moves it relative to where it originally was. Absolute is relative to where it was originally positioned, with the exception of when you start to add these properties. As soon as you start to add the top, bottom, right, and left, we're measuring from the top corner of the page to put it down, and then margin by default is going to be laid around this as well. Okay, fixed. That's our final one. This one works the same way as absolute. So you lose your size, you lose reference. It's taken off the page, it's put back onto the page after everything else is built. The difference with fixed is when you come up with your coordinate system, so say top 50 pixels, left 50 pixels. So it's sitting up here relative to the top corner of the screen. Now I'm just going to add into my main element. I'm going to add a whole ton of padding on the bottom here just to give myself a scroll bar. So let's go into main, say padding bottom. Well, let's make it 600 pixels. There we are. Now we have a bit of a scroll bar here. The difference between absolute and fixed, because up until now they're doing the exact same thing. The only difference between them is that when you scroll, the absolute stays where it was positioned, and fixed maintains its position relative to the top corner of the viewable area. So absolute stays with the page content, and fixed stays relative to where the screen is. Okay, so that is absolute, relative, static, and fixed. Those are the 4 main ones. Sticky is a new one, special case. I've got a video just on that one. And there's also some other interesting things that you can do when combining absolute and relative. If you put something that's positioned absolute inside of something that's positioned relative, you get some interesting things. And I have a second video on that. I will put the links to those 2 videos at the end of this one. Okay, so I hope that clears up the differences between the different position properties. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. I encourage you to watch those other 2 videos. If you found this useful, please share it. And as always, thanks for watching.